Welcome everybody to another mini lecture. Today we're going to be talking about quasi-experiments. These are very problematic in the scientific literature, in my opinion, as we should not be drawing any conclusions from them. So I promise by the end of this video you'll have a good understanding of the philosophy behind quasi-experiments, what they are. We're not really going to delve deep into examples today. I'm going to try and give you guys a framework to be able to look at any quasi-experiment and to be able to draw conclusions from it, rather than needing to reference back to a video to be able to understand each experiment in depth. I'll equip you with the tools to be able to understand why quasi-experiments are not internally valid. And on that topic, I promise that you'll also learn about internal and external validity and why they're important in assessing the validity of a scientific experiment. Now, quasi-experiments resemble a true experiment, but they're unable to employ a proper control. And so, in a way, they're not able to employ scientific method properly. They're not able to control the independent and dependent variables or account for all confounding variables. Are quasi-experiments pseudoscientific? Well, you could look at the definition of pseudoscience. A pseudoscience is essentially conclusions drawn from unscientific sources, from sources who do not employ the scientific method. When it comes to quasi-experiments, there's a lot of room for interpretation. It's very subjective. There's also a lot of assumptions within quasi-experiments. We need to assume that the improper controls are valid, right? And this is why we assess internal validity. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk about internal validity first, then we're going to move on to external validity, then we're going to come back and talk about quasi-experiments as a whole. I'm also going to be doing a book giveaway at 1,000 subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do that down below. Give us a like, comment, share. That really helps us grow. If your subscribers are private, I need you to message me on Instagram, or you really need to leave a comment down below to be included in the giveaway, because I can't see all my subscribers, only those who have public subscribers turned on in their settings. Okay, internal validity is the major factor inhibiting the validity of quasi-experiments. This is the major challenge that quasi-experiments face. Internal validity is the major challenge that quasi-experiments face. Largely, this challenge and this problem stems from the differences between the control group and the experimental groups. We know that with quasi-experiments, there are various reasons why we cannot employ a proper control, a valid control that makes sense to address the research question or the hypothesis. And so with quasi-experiments, it's very difficult to assess this cause and effect relationship. It's really difficult to come to a conclusion about the hypothesis in a sure manner. A major challenge in quasi-experiments and regarding internal validity is uncontrolled confounding variables. These are variables that have not been accounted for in the research parameters, and you cannot rule them out as being true cause of the effect being observed and studied. In essence, the internal validity is the extent in which a study can ascribe a cause and effect relationship between the variables being studied without inferring from other factors, without external inferences. We understand with the scientific method that we're looking at the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. The dependent being that which we're studying, that's the observed phenomenon. The independent variable is what we're trying to manipulate and change to see if that is the causal factor of the change observed in the dependent variable. So in essence, internal validity is the measure in which that relationship is true or not. You could ascribe any sort of cause and effect to anything. Okay, so the internal validity depends on inferences. And inferences are said to be internally validated if the causal relationship is properly demonstrated. So I suppose the criteria of causal inferences are the following. So firstly, we have a temporal precedence. The cause must come before the effect. We also have covariation. In essence, the cause and effect should occur at roughly the same time. And lastly, we have the most problematic inference, in my opinion, non-spuriousness. This essentially states that there are no other valid explanations for the covariation or the temporal precedence or the cause and effect relationship in general. Realistically, there's a very large logical fallacy at play here. If you cannot conceive that there's another option, it must be false, right? And this would be an argument from incredulity. So when you're inferring from quasi-experiments, and you're assessing the internal validity, it's a very subjective matter. It would depend largely on the scientist. It depends largely on what the scientists know. It depends largely on the bias of the scientific field, right? The scientific consensus. What is that? That will affect the non-spuriousness of internal validity, of quasi-experiments. Because when it comes to things like the germ theory, which we obviously talk about a lot here, at this point in time, due to the dogmatic nature of this theory, a lot of the alternative explanations are inconceivable by scientists in the field who study the germ theory. They could not imagine that an infectious disease is caused by a toxicity rather than a little viral particle that can self-replicate and cause disease in an individual. So you could see the bias involved, especially in the last step. The preceding two steps, temporal precedence and covariation, sure, they make sense. But if you're really looking at the root cause, perhaps covariation is also an assumption. Right? Why couldn't something happen a long time ago and have a cascading effect over time? Especially for something in psychology research. Does the effect of one's upbringing in childhood have an effect on their being 20, 30, 50 years down the road? Especially if it's not dealt with. There's a whole lot of speculation in the psychology fields that our childhood and our experiences shape who we are. Right? This is almost central in psychotherapy and psychology in general. All of our experiences shape our worldview. It all comes together to generate our being now. There's not much covariation here. Something could happen to you when you're 6 years old and you'll never forget it until the day you die. So I think this is a major assumption. Now, when it comes to psychology research, you may think, oh, well, that's not comparable to that of the natural sciences or the biological sciences. Okay, so say you believe in metabolism. You believe in the biochemical construct of the body, the materialistic billiard ball theory of biochemistry. Isn't it so that there are cascading events in the body? The introduction of glucose much further down the line leads to the generation of ATP. It's a lengthy process to get there. And perhaps the introduction of too much glucose leads to beta oxidation and leads to increases in fat cells in the body. This is not necessarily happening at the exact same time. Now, is there covariation? Is this occurring in the same time frame? Perhaps, but where do you draw the line? There's a lot of bias in what is this time frame in which the cause and effect relationship is more reliable. At what point? At what time frame does this become less reliable? Is it over time? Does it become less probable? There's a lot of assumptions happening here. And you're going to see that this relies a lot on bias, right? You can conceive this in your mind too, that what you understand of the world and of the natural sciences is going to affect the conclusions and observations that you make. Thomas Kuhn proved this. The observer's biases, the observer's worldview and thoughts and knowledge is going to affect the way that they interpret things, is going to affect the way that they induce from observation. It's even going to affect the observations that they make themselves. We see patterns in data, right? But people will see different patterns based on what they believe. Are there objective patterns in data? Now, that will get more into mathematics, which we'll discuss down the road as well. But it's easy to conceive at this point but it's very easy to see at this point that that's a possible source of bias, of misinterpretation, right? So it's very important to consider these factors when we're looking at internal validity, when we're looking at quasi-experiments. And the major problem with the internal validity of quasi-experiments is confounding variables. These are variables that are not accounted for in the experimental design, in the methodology of the experiment, that could have an effect on the dependent variable. So these are independent variables that we don't necessarily address in the experimental design. These are the spurious relationships that we're talking about here, right? So if a scientist doesn't think of all the different confounding variables possible, They're omitted from the discussion, they're omitted from the literature, they're omitted from the consensus based on the scientists themselves and their worldview and their biases, as we mentioned. Those play a major role in the effects on the inferences made, right? What effects could be confounding? What variables could be affecting this phenomenon? If a scientist truly believes that toxicity has no effect on infectious illness, well, then they're not going to even think about, or why would they include that discussion in their paper, right? If it's so obviously absurd that that dogmatic scientist thinks that toxicity has nothing to do with infectious diseases, why would they include it in their paper? It makes no sense for them to do that, right? But that's biased. That's subjective. It's based on their worldview. It's based on the scientific consensus. You know, this field of science is the epitome of group think. You dare not go against the scientific consensus. You dare not go against the experts in the field. But I digress. Confounding variables threaten the internal validity of quasi-experiments. And so we could take it back to experiments, to proper experiments that employ the scientific method, which are attempting to control all the confounding variables. And so in randomized controlled trials, right, that's what you're trying to account for. You want to make sure that the assignment is random to ensure that you're not choosing biases based on general factors of whatever it may be, right? Random assignment is fundamental to the controlled methodology of experiments, of the scientific method. You know, double, triple-blind studies aim to minimize fraud in the triple-blind sense, aim to minimize placebo with the double-blind, right? Where the participants and the scientists are blind to the parameters because they don't want their thoughts and actions to influence their results. You know, these are more prevalent in quasi-experiments because there is no valid control. So we understand that randomized controlled trials and the scientific method aims to minimize the confounding variables, aims to control the factors, right? We don't have to rely on these inferences because we're focused on ensuring that there's only one cause, there's only one factor being tested at a time, right? We want to ensure that there's only an isolated independent variable introduced so that there are no other options of those being the cause of the effect that we observe. Now, does every experimental research paper and do this? Definitely not. We've observed that in virology and germ theory, right? During Koch's postulates, during the contagion studies. Never is a germ introduced and caused disease. Never is a virus introduced by itself, as that's impossible. We cannot isolate viruses. They're always introduced with a cell culture, which contains a plethora of other agents. And even if you're looking at cytopathic effects, electron microscopy, genetic material, immunological assays, they're all confounding variables. And so that's a major problem that we're going to get back to in a little bit here. But at least if an experiment admits that it's quasi in nature, that is a very helpful thing to know. Now, interestingly enough, it's admitted that with quasi-experimental research, the internal validity is lower while the external validity is higher. We're going to touch on external validity in a minute. So with the external validity, it's actually lower in true experimental research because you get so specific in the parameters in the laboratory setting and isolation of the variable, which may not be a natural phenomenon. You know, when it comes to quasi-experiment, you can actually see a benefit there, that you can observe things in a more natural state. Now, should you be drawing cause and effect relationships and conclusions from that and shaping the theories and the scientific consensus? I don't think so. I don't necessarily think so. Should they be used in conjunction? Perhaps. Is the whole field of empiricism flawed and have many, many problems riddled within it? Absolutely. Absolutely, right? Where is the confirming factors? No, I can't get into that right now. We're going to save that for another video. But right now we're going to touch on external validity. Okay, I mentioned quasi-experiments have higher external validity than, of course, perfectly conducted experimental research. So external validity really has to do with generalization. How do the results and conclusions of a study be generalized across populations, to other environments, to other situations. So in essence, what we're looking at with external validity is, do the results of the study translate to the real world or to the populations that we're concerned with, or the phenomenon that we're concerned with? A quick example would be if we conduct studies in zoo environments, if we conduct studies on animals within zoos. Do the results of that study have any weight and any applicability within the wild? Can we apply the results of studies done on zoo animals and apply that to wild animals out in the real world, out in nature? And so you can break this down. We have population validity, which you could probably guess that this is where we're assuming that the results are applied to the larger population or to different populations. Do studies conducted on Caucasian individuals apply to that of Asian descent living in Asia, right? So this is a cultural thing as well, right? It's not just necessarily taking from a small sample to a larger sample. It can be from a specific subset of people with a certain disease. Does that apply to people with other diseases? This is seen a lot in psychology. When I read a lot of the psychology research, they say that you cannot necessarily extrapolate the results from a study conducted on one specific cultural group to that of another. That's why in psychology, when they employ tests and they employ, cognitive behavioral therapy, they need to test it on different subsets of population. They need to test it on people with different cultural backgrounds, with different worldviews, with people, religious people, sick people, comorbidity, right? That's another factor. So does that apply to every subset of the population? This is what we're concerned with population validity, and this is a sub-branch of external validity. We also have ecological validity, which is where the results of the study can be extrapolated to other settings, other situations, other environments, right? And this is the zoo example, right? Does the environment of a zoo apply to that of wild animals, to the real world? Do laboratory mice translate to mice in the real world? Do mice translate to humans, right? Does mouse studies translate to humans? That's a great question you could ask yourself, because a lot of research is done on mice and rats, and can we really extrapolate that sort of information from those studies, right? So as you can see here, the external validity is going to be less strong in randomized controlled trials in true experimental designs. You can see how quasi-experiments actually may be helpful in this case. Now, can we really draw any conclusions outside of the framework of the study itself? There lies a difficulty. And you may say that you could confirm this observation with looking out into the real world and seeing the applicability of these phenomena that we've studied. Like, look at the state of medicine or science or technology. And I think it's just important that we remain objective in that observation as well, and we understand that if you're looking at medicine, of course we've done some major advancements in emergency medicine. But when it comes to the general population, especially in the West with the highest amount of funding for medicine, we're a population that's sicker than ever, right? The first world countries like Canada and the United States have the highest amount of money dedicated to medicine. However, 1 in 2 people are obese in the States, and the statistics for disease are through the roof, absolutely through the roof, where nutritionists run rampant and all of these health officials are trying to make the population more healthy, but we're more diseased than ever. So it's important to remain objective in that sort of observation. But I digress. We're going to get back to external validity here. And considering population validity, John Lynch was an interesting individual who stated that it's always impossible to extrapolate from one population to another. And I think that's interesting, and I think that's one of the shortfalls of empiricism. When you're concerned with praxeology, when you're concerned with the study of human nature, it's impossible to dictate the behaviors and thought patterns and knowledge that an individual is going to have in the future. And that's going to affect how they live their lives. That's going to affect what they do, their habits. It's going to affect their health. It's going to affect their decisions. So it's very difficult, especially in the field of psychology, which is why you see the reproducibility crisis highest in that of psychology, although antibody research is not far behind, which we'll discuss further in future episodes. So some of the problems that threaten external validity is the selection bias of the samples of the populations being studied, right? Are you studying a certain cultural group with certain beliefs or certain worldviews? Are these being grouped up in a certain manner, especially in quasi-experiments where you're not randomly assigning people to different groups, right? You also have interaction effects between the sample and treatment, right? We need to understand how these interactions are occurring within the study itself. This threatens the external validity, right? Is the study design actually manipulating the results of the study, and it's going to inhibit our ability to extrapolate this to further studies, to further populations, to further environments. Now, of course, the study setting is going to have a lot to do with the problems facing external validity as well, right? Artificial laboratory settings don't necessarily mimic that of a natural environment, right? And the laboratories are often sterile, whereas nature is full of diversity and biology. It's full of life, right? Even on the microscopic scale. There's also something called the Hawthorne effect, right? The reactivity of the participants in the study itself, right? The Hawthorne effect essentially states that individuals change their behaviors when they're being observed, right? You can see that this is not necessarily just in quasi-experiments either, but in all experiments. When they're being observed, they may want to perform better. They may want to perform in a different manner. They may have some sort of thing in their brain where they want to perform poorly when being observed, right? We never know how that's going to affect somebody. So this is a problem in all experiments, really. This concerns the external validity of not just quasi-experimental studies, but all experimental studies, right? So this is what threatens the external validity of all experiments. Okay, let's do the quasi-experiments justice and go over a few of the advantages of these study designs. So quasi-experiments are often more feasible than other studies, especially real-world studies, right? Studies that are concerned about the real world. Sometimes it's not practical or even ethical to randomly assign participants in a study design. And so quasi-experiments can allow for what would be an unethical experiment to become ethical. I could certainly back this, right? Ethics are a very important thing that I don't think have been respected in the history of science. I don't necessarily think they're respected fully now, but they're certainly better than they used to be. Really, the ethic that's most concerned is integrity, but we'll have to go over that another time. As we just mentioned, we of course have external validity, right? The ecological validity of quasi-experiments is an absolute strength of the study, right? We can actually look at a more natural study design than that done in a laboratory, right? It's interesting because there are many drawbacks to the isolation of variables. Duhem and Quine actually did a great job pointing this out. If you want to look into that further, that's another topic that we're going to discuss at length. But quasi-experiments do seem to be more reliable on their external validity front. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the cause and effect, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the relationships between the variables being studied in the experiment. So this doesn't necessarily mean that we're correct, right? This just means that what's studied and the conclusions that we come to can be applied to the external world, right? There is no correctness within this. This is all to do with applicability, with generalization. So that's really important to note. So quasi-experiments are also well equipped to conduct long-term studies, right? Studies over 20, 30, 40, 50 years even, right, is not an absurd thing. Actually, it's a very valuable thing. You can't really run a controlled scientific experiment for that long. And I'm not going to say that there's nothing that can be drawn from these long-term studies as well, right? Especially if you're attempting to control maybe a certain diet. Sydney Diet Heart or Minnesota Coronary would have been something along the terms of a long-term quasi-experimental research, experimental design, right? Where they assess the ingestion of saturated versus unsaturated fats. I think there's a certain amount of information that you can draw from that. Now, can you infer anything about cause and effect? Again, no, you cannot. But it's definitely more suited for long-term studies, which is very valuable, very, very valuable, and can be very helpful within the research itself. Again, it's just important to note that with these advantages, right? These are great advantages. These are not the basis of scientific fact, right? We're not looking at facts here. We're not looking at factual cause and effects. There is less evidence for the relationship between variables in quasi-experiment that there is in true experimental research design. So it's very important to understand that just because something can be done for 30 years doesn't make it any more correct. Just because something can be extrapolated to and generalized to a greater population doesn't mean that it's correct. Just because it's more ethical and more realistic doesn't mean that it's any more correct. So those are the strengths. The strengths of quasi-experiments are not accuracy and correctness. Let's jump right into the disadvantages, as we were already kind of harping on poor quasi-experiments there. Internal validity obviously is the largest disadvantage. You cannot be sure about the cause and effect relationship. I don't care how much you try to minimize it. We went over the inferences that are made. We went over the assumptions. There are many assumptions. Too many to be sure about any sort of conclusion about a causal relationship. Quasi-experiments should never, ever be foundational in the literature to identify a cause and effect relationship, which is why when they try to slide in the germ theory research under experimental, when it's in fact quasi-experimental because they do not actually isolate variables, especially in virology. Virology is all quasi-experiments. They all rely on each other. They all rely on themselves. It's a circular self-confirming process, right? There is no internal validity to the germ theory. It may seem applicable because antibiotics seem to heal us and alleviate us from our symptoms, but in fact they don't heal us. They just cut off our healing symptoms. They cut off the healing properties of our body, right? And so they disconnect us with our symptoms, which are healing factors. And if the germ theory weren't so dogmatic, you could look at that observation and interpret it in a different way, hence it being more indicative of a quasi-experiment, right? There's many ways to interpret these observations. But yeah, internal validity is the absolute largest challenge. I don't care how you try to spin it. This is very subjective. This makes quasi-experiments extremely subjective, and obviously introduces a couple of problems within logic, right? It relies a lot on the current scientific consensus, so ad populum, and it relies a lot on the expertise of scientists, appeal to authority, or expert opinion, logical fallacy, right? Just because a scientist thinks that their quasi-experiment accounted for all the confounding variables doesn't necessarily mean that that's true, right? So of course, within quasi-experiments, there's a lack of randomization. There's also a lack of controls. There's a lack of isolation of the variable. Quasi-experiments have very weak causal inferences. Nothing should be drawn as a conclusion of anything causal within a quasi-experiment. And this truly speaks to the danger of passing experiments as true scientific experiments with valid controls, isolation of variables, all of the principles of the scientific method, passing them as these true experiments when in fact they're quasi-experiments, because the way that you look at that completely changes the way that you can interpret the results. Okay, do quasi-experiments hold any value scientifically? In short, no. In short, you cannot draw any causal relationships from it. It does not employ proper scientific method. Are quasi-experiments pseudoscientific? Not necessarily, but if you're going to base an entire theory off of quasi-experiments, that theory would be pseudoscientific. There needs to be grounded evidence. And that's why when you're assessing a theory, we talk a lot about the germ theory here. When you go and look at the studies done, even though they claim to be true experimental research, they all are quasi-experimental in nature, right? The very few that are properly controlled actually show results that are not indicative of a germ causal relationship to disease, right? The germs are not the underlying factors of disease. When you isolate those variables out, you realize that they have nothing to do with actually causing the disease. They are a bystander. They are a confounding variable in a way. Are quasi-experiments useless? No, they're not useless. There is a certain amount of information that you can draw from them. I think that they're valuable in and of themselves. As you know, we mentioned, if they're properly designed and if there's a large body of research on the same study parameters over different populations in different areas of the world, considering different worldviews and things of this nature, especially in psychology, there can be valuable induction drawn from that, perhaps. You know, obviously our biases and dogma get in the way of this, which is very problematic, which is why it's very important for you to go and assess the research and read the research yourself. If you want to learn, if you want to have knowledge and wisdom, you need to go to the data. You cannot go to the opinions of scientists. The data is much more reliable, even though a lot of the data is conveyed in a manipulative way, and a lot of the data is fraudulent, which is again admitted by the literature itself. You know, I just want to highlight one more time that the major problem in science is that true experimental research design is a rare phenomenon. A lot of it is quasi-experimental in nature, but they're not going to tell you that because it's much more convincing to think that you have a randomized triple-blind control study on cupcake research when the control is invalid for the parameters of the study. You know, you're assessing safety, but you're comparing cupcakes to aluminum hydroxide injections. Realistically, you're controlling nothing. And that makes the study quasi-experimental. And so the whole cupcakeology field is based on quasi-experiments. There are no real controls happening here. They control these different types of chemicals and things of this nature, but they never control them against saline. You know, there's not even real longitudinal studies done on these cupcakes. If you could find me a 20-year study on a cupcake, I would be thrilled to read that, but they do not exist, right? They do not exist. And most pharmaceutical drugs don't do that either, because the lifespan of pharmaceutical drugs is quite short. Now, there are exceptions, of course. Things like diabetes have done with insulin. It would be a great example of something that's helpful for individuals, because individuals with diabetes, type 1, specifically type 2 can be cured quite easily, but type 1, they would just die without insulin. So we're going to give things like that the pass, right? And you know, but when it comes to these other pharmaceutical drugs, a lot of them don't last very long. And so, you know, because by the time they do a 5, 10, 20-year study, they're realizing, oh shit, these are not working out as we thought they should. So quasi-experiments hold value. They are not the foundation of any study. They don't hold any true rigorous scientific value, but they may be valuable in certain fields. Maybe as psychology would probably be the best. You know, when it really comes to the natural phenomenon, when the studies of biology, there's really no need for quasi-experiments, you know, maybe only for ethical concerns. But at that point, you know, if you're testing pharmaceutical drugs on individuals and you're very confident and willing that, you know, you want to test them on a randomized controlled trial, is that ethical, right? That's a great question. But then why can't we run these other tests of exposing people to germs in a more controlled manner, where you isolate the variable, and for some reason that is unethical. It's kind of backwards in my opinion, when one is a natural phenomenon, one is a petrochemical. You know, really, what are we looking at here? The ethics are kind of flipped upside down nowadays. It seems more ethical in nature, but in reality, we're not there yet. Okay, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe, comment, like, share, and send me a message on Instagram confirming your subscription to enter the book giveaway. I think we're going to give away The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. This is a fantastic book to understand science in general, to understand the structure of the scientific consensus in a way, right? How science evolves over time. And so I think it's a very, very valuable book. So if you guys found this informative or you like this lecture, again, please like, share, comment, subscribe. That's the best way to help support me. There are extra links down there if you want to really help support this channel. Everything always goes right back into it. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed it, you know what to do. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Take care.